So one thing that came up in my remarks was that I have I would say an existential concern about the state of the grid, which probably come out more in this discussion. But I'm particularly excited to have this panel because we have people who know a lot about the grid, are very intimately involved in the grid in various ways. And so I have some topics I want to cover. And I want to have it so that I often see panels and different people talk about different things. In this case, we have experts, and I want to get each expert's view on all of these things, and then we'll see if there's disagreement within them or with me, then we'll sort of explore it. And can someone update the time here so I make sure that we don't go long? And then, so let's just go from there. So the first thing I want to ask all of you is, how concerned are you about the state of the grid today and its trajectory over the next decade?
So reliability is fundamental. Number of power companies represented in the room, you have a legal obligation to serve. Increasingly, our economy relies on 24/7 dispatchable power, including some of the most strategic sectors of our economy. And you made the point about industry and manufacturing requires large volumes of 24/7 power. And there's another reason beyond just all of the needs and benefits of modern society and our economy. If we want to accomplish the environmental goals that we've set for ourselves, if we fail on reliability, then we lose public and policymaker support from day one. Maybe just point out some of the things that we're working on in the Department of Energy and the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management that relate to this directly, is investing in the development and commercialization of technologies that provide 24/7 low and zero carbon dispatchable power. You mentioned carbon capture. We can get to this. I'm a lot more optimistic than you are.
Okay, yeah.
And that applies to coal, natural gas, and biomass, sometimes both together. And we had the first commercial scale retrofit of a coal plant about 10 years ago in Saskatchewan, Boundary Dam. Then Petronova near Houston was serial number 2. And we just announced funding for serial number 3, which will be in my state of North Dakota, the Tundra project, full-scale commercial retrofit of a coal unit, putting $2.5 billion into 6 commercial scale retrofits, 2 coal, 2 natural gas, and 2 industrial processes. I would also note that Calpine, which is the largest merchant power producer with natural gas in the United States, received the awards for the 2 commercial scale retrofits of natural gas power plants. Those will be serial numbers 1 and 2 in the world. But what's important as the largest merchant generator in the United States is they have a very stepwise plan to accomplish emissions reductions of half of their emissions from their entire fleet within about a decade's time. I would also note that there are other pathways, for example, hydrogen, either produced electrolytically or with natural gas or biomass with carbon capture, that can provide for 24/7 dispatchable power.
So are you, so the core question is, I want to talk about carbon capture near the end, but maybe we could go into a little bit now.
But you're quite pessimistic about some of the options.
That's true. Okay, but I just want to know from you though, but the sort of most straightforward question is, how concerned are you? So, because I would say, well, if you look at the trajectory, we have 1,000 gigawatts of dispatchable power. If you look at the plans, we're supposed to shut down about, according to the coal industry, you look at the numbers, 20% of that's supposed to be shut down by 2030, according to the Biden administration. To me, that's terrifying when we're already having shortages. So the fact that people are investigating sort of carbon capture on a small scale, that can be nice.
No, but that's my point. We're more than investigating it, we're deploying it.
But you're deploying it on a scale of that magnitude?
Well, but that's, when you're talking about large-scale capital equipment, that's how you deploy it.
Is what?
Is you start with projects, you demonstrate them at commercial scale, you build investor and market confidence, and that's why we have a company like Calpine that's moving forward with a stepwise plan.
Right, but if you look at what your colleague Michael Regan is doing, not your department, but Michael Regan is doing at the EPA, they're trying to shut down 20% of our reliable capacity in the next 6 years. So I'm saying this scale is irrelevant for that, for countering that.
It is not irrelevant, because if you look at the nature of technology transition, take shale gas and hydraulic fracturing. That was developed in the same research development demonstration process with industry, and in the late 2000s, it was deployed commercially, and within a decade, it transformed human prospects with respect to energy, as I'm sure you will agree. We have the capacity I actually think that what you presented here was not technology optimism, it was technology pessimism, and it was narrow. It was trying to create sort of a parody of the argument between fossil fuels and renewables when there are multiple pathways to provide 24/7 dispatchable power. So I'm very much talking about this, and we have the time, because if you look at the EPA rule, it only applies to coal-fired power plants in the case of coal. If they are to remain running after 2040, then they have to retrofit by 2030. That's 6 years, and later on we can talk about it, but for the first time in US history, we have the most comprehensive framework of federal funding, financing, incentives to help industry deploy these technologies, and we have, as a result of that, 200 publicly announced carbon management projects in the United States, 25 of which are in the power sector. So the idea that we can't accomplish this and we have to throw up our hands
No,
is wrong.
it's not throw up our hands. Okay,
well, but you did throw up your hands multiple times because you basically said we shouldn't solve the problem.
I understand you got to defend this administration's
Biden administration. I've worked 20 years on this.
But let's just look at the basic numbers here. So again, you're referring to one specific nuance of a rule. If you look at the coal industry announcements, the announcements of retiring, I'll send you the link, reliable power generation. Again, we're supposed to go from 1,000 gigawatts to 800 by the year 2030. You are talking about stuff that's on a small scale, that requires an enormous amount of funding. It doesn't scale like shale gas does at all. It's totally different mechanics. And if you let's just look at what the IRA says. The IRA says we get $150 to put CO2 underground. $150 a ton for carbon, 85, sorry, I'll explain the math. It's $85 a ton, right? You burn 1 ton of coal, you basically get $150 for the CO2. Like 1.75 tons of CO2 generated. So we're paying people for $30 worth of coal. We're paying them $150 to put it underground. This is a massive subsidy. This is not something that's scaling quickly in any kind of market way. Sorry, I got to go on to the others, but we can talk more about it. So again, we have a very optimistic view of the grid. What's your view of the grid?
I'm quite concerned about the grid, particularly the near-term implications of what we're experiencing. We are seeing, by the way, I'm Jimmy Staton. I'm president and CEO at Santee Cooper. Indirectly, we serve about 2 million South Carolinians with electricity. Directly, we serve another 200,000, and we serve about 200,000 water customers in the low country of South Carolina. And what we're experiencing, and we're seeing in a lot of areas, is just mammoth growth. We're seeing significant growth in data centers, and the opportunities that those data centers are going to bring are huge. We're seeing reindustrialization, particularly in the southeast of the country. We are also seeing the transformation or the electrification of the transport market, along with the heating market. And so that is creating incredible growth. And that, just to give you an example for us, we haven't really experienced much in the way of growth over the last 15 or 20 years. Between now and the end of this decade, I expect to see 40% electric growth in South Carolina on the Santee Cooper system. So that growth is coming quickly, and it's scary to me, quite frankly. In addition to that, permitting of any energy resource right now is challenging. I put out an RFP for solar 3 years ago. We don't have 1 megawatt of that solar that has been placed yet. And in that time, the cost of solar has gone up by about 100%. On top of that, natural gas plant takes about 10 years to finally get permitted and put in place. And so in every area that I'm seeing, and we're seeing it the same thing on the transmission side. Our transmission business we need to expand it to make it more robust, to live in this new universe that we are trying to create. But it takes 10 years to build a transmission line, effectively anywhere in the country. So that is a problem. And then, Alex, as you mentioned, we're seeing folks close down coal plants around the country. We had announced at Santee Cooper that we were going to close a coal plant in 2029, 1,200 megawatts. We've pulled that back. And in fact, I won't give out a time frame by which we will close the coal plant. Because my concern in the near term is it takes 2 years to get a data center put in place, and it takes me 5 to 10 years to get something that can generate the capacity for that data center put in place. And so I am very concerned about the grid. We saw it December of 2022. South Carolina, and I'm sorry to say this, I've only been at Santee Cooper for 2 years, but we had the first set of rolling blackouts we've ever experienced as a company, because we had one of our facilities went down. The southeast was incredibly tight, and so we were challenged. And if you saw the press at the time, everything in the southeast was challenged. North Carolina, South Carolina, into the Georgia area. And so I'm concerned about the integrity of the grid in the near term. And finally, if you combine that with, and I appreciate Brad's comments about the work that they are doing and the money that the government is investing, because I think those will pay long-term benefits. But in the short term, I don't see those things bringing the value to the table that will enable us to meet these growing needs as we work our way through this energy transition. So I'm concerned about it. We're doing everything we can do at Santee Cooper to move as quickly as we can to ensure that we've got adequate resources to meet the growing needs of the state.
Thank you. Jimmy?
I agree with Jimmy. I am very concerned about the grid, and I also believe everyone in the room should be very concerned about it. And we're losing some of the grid reliability because of some known reasons. One is we're replacing dispatchable generation far faster, rapidly retiring these before replacement generation is ready. So I believe in the future there could be an all of the above approach, but I'd like to think everyone seems to want to think about 10 years out. I think we need to think more about present and more about the short term. I mean, as Alex mentioned, I know there's 70,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation have announced retirements between now and 2030. It's not that far off, and I don't think that we can build the transmission lines to replace that in that short amount of time. So if we want to enjoy what we have today, and FERC and a lot of these organizations, grid operators, have the very same concerns. They have warned us about rolling blackouts. And if we want to have the electricity on demand, as many of us here in America are spoiled by, we just flip a switch and it's here, we have to be concerned about the grid. And we have to speak up about it. We have to make sure that dispatchable generation is replaced with equal dispatchable generation. So it can't be wind and solar that's only going to perform 2% in high peak demands. Now, someday they may, but they're certainly not here yet. And I'm really an all the above person. I believe that for the grid to be reliable as we need it to be, we need to have an all of the above approach. We need all these energy, but we're moving far too fast. So I have huge concerns today that, the grid is not reliable, and that's what it needs to be. The grid operators need to make sure that they look at all of the attributes of reliability, fuel security, the things that have stored on the ground, such as coal, that can be there in high demand and has great fluctuality of what's needed on the demand. So it's flexibility, it's time. I'm more concerned about time it takes to replace the dispatchable generation that we have and to build out the transmission lines. And I'll just give you an example of that. To reach the goals by 2026 to keep the grid reliable as we like, it's estimated that between 1,400 and 10,000 miles of transmission lines will need to be built, high-grade transmission lines. In 2022, they built 675 miles. And in 2023, January through November, we've built 275 miles. So it's a massive undertaking. And we sat here today and enjoy all of the fruits of fossil fuels and energy on demand. So to me, I have a real concern. CONSOL Energy is doing a lot of innovations and things around about having an available grid. And the reason that's important, if we're going to grow as the projection state we are in electrical demand, we're going to need the transmissions, we're going to need the dispatchable energy to be able to provide that electricity for those manufacturers that want to come in, to heat our homes, to cool our houses, to do all the things that are basic human needs that we have here in the U.S.
So one point that came up with a bunch of you was the difficulty of building things. And I think this adds to my fear about the trajectory of the grid, because we're shutting down things and it's almost impossible to build things quickly. I mean, I think of it as China, they can build a subway station in 9 hours. We can't build a yoga studio in 9 months in this country. And I think it's worth thinking about why that is, because I think it's very related to why people don't like fossil fuels. So if you notice with fossil fuels, one interesting thing is most of the people who are against fossil fuels are also against nuclear, and they're also hostile to hydro. And why is that? And the argument I make in Fossil Future is a lot of the motivation behind this movement is a belief that human impact is bad, and they don't like any kind of impact. So hydro impacts, we shouldn't dam things, and even nuclear, it's wrong to impact things in this way. But you're also seeing this anti-impact manifest itself in delays of solar and wind, because it's anti-mining often, and anti-building things, anti-laying transmission lines. I think that there's the modern green energy movement. I mean, there are people like Brad who are really pro-energy, but a lot of the modern green energy movement is a ruse, because it's really the green part of it is a movement that's against human impact and that opposes it at every turn and makes it hard to build everything. And when you have that hostility, what you find is that you're inhibiting fossil fuels, but you're also inhibiting everything else. And I think one fundamental thing we need is we need a pro-development, pro-human movement that's not pro any particular technology, but that's pro-energy freedom. I think that's one big thing we're missing. I will say, though, that one of the tricks that the green energy movement has is what I think Brad called me technologically pessimistic, and the Greens try to portray themselves as technologically optimistic. I don't agree with that at all. To be truly technologically optimistic is to be pro-freedom and to want all the technologies to be able to compete. What is actually advocated by the green energy movement is picking and choosing certain things, often the things with the least promise, like somehow relying on all unreliable solar and wind, and then saying, hey, don't you believe in innovation? Let's make it happen, and by the way, you're making it impossible to development. Like, that's just falsely reassuring us that fossil fuels, getting rid of them, will be okay. That's not technological optimism at all. And economically, and the most important thing is economic, not technological. Technology serves economics. Ultimately, we want a lot of energy for everyone. The fact that you can do something in a lab, and if the government funds stuff in a lab, but it makes it impossible for people to actually do things on a large scale in the economy, is bad. And this is going to be a great thing for you to talk about. Right now, many people, including me, would argue the grid doesn't properly value reliability. So I argued, for example, that we pay, the grid basically we have to pay more in effect for solar and wind than for reliable forms of electricity. So how do you think the grid should value reliability? I'm asking you, I understand. You can give me your opinions later, but I want to know you first.
I'm totally supportive of rules and policies.
You got to use the mic.
Sorry. I'm totally supportive of rules and policies that place greater value, whether it's market rules at the ISO level, capacity, payments, there's a whole range of mechanisms. Mostly controlled, some by FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In fact, considerably more could be done by FERC, but also at the regional level in the power markets, the ISOs, and of course state regulatory commissions. And they should all be placing greater value on technologies that provide low and zero carbon resources, 24/7 dispatchable. And if you are investing in those technologies, whether it's nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture on coal, carbon capture on natural gas, you name it, you should be able to earn a rate of return that will, it's basically recognizes and rewards the services that provides to the grid. And we need to have a much more concentrated effort in this country. I also agree that if we're to solve the climate challenge, then we have to build things. We have to build them comprehensively. Respectfully, I think you misdiagnosed the challenge. It's actually larger than you suggest it is. If only it were just grassroots environmental organizations and national environmental organizations opposing development, we'd have a challenge on our hands. But it's, yes, in some parts of the country, it is those groups opposing fossil energy-related projects. But I have a ranch in south central North Dakota. We have 3 wind farms on our ridge. My neighbors, as you might imagine, don't want to see another wind farm. It's one of the most conservative places in the Midwest, but I was back there in August, and they are organizing now to oppose a CO2 pipeline. And so this is a phenomenon that is not limited to Democrats or the left or environmental NGOs. This is a grassroots phenomenon that crosses the entire political spectrum. You have conservative landowners and county officials in Louisiana asserting that CO2 storage is dangerous. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not dangerous, it's quite benign. But that is not coming from the left. There is also opposition from the left. So I just think we need to be real sober and realistic about the challenges ahead of us, because we have to do a lot better job of showing local communities and stakeholders of all political stripes that development of energy projects and infrastructure is in their interests.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I agree the NIMBY stuff is also a very big issue. Jimmy?
The markets, the organized markets we have currently in the country are fantastic for driving down the cost of energy. We, as an industry, we've not done a great job of being able to explain, though, there's a huge difference between the cost of energy, which on any given day, you should drive down to the absolute lowest cost that you can, provide as many options to your customers as you possibly can. But it's on those peak days, those challenging days, when you have to have capacity there, that our markets fail. We have 3-year capacity markets in essentially all of the organized markets in the United States. That is not long enough for people to make long-term decisions, to make long-term investments in the industry. And so they're not being compensated. And so what have we found has happened? We saw it in Texas. We saw it in the Midwest. The only thing that's being built right now are renewable resources to drive down the cost of energy. We've got to find a different way to value capacity. And part of the problem is we've got that, it's really trifurcated markets, because you've got energy market, you've got a capacity market that doesn't work, and then you have states that are concerned about capacity that have their own IRPs, and they try to enforce new capacity into the market, and it has a challenge of being connected to those same RTOs, because it's not necessarily driving down the cost of energy. So it's a major problem for us in the Southeast. The way that we deal with it is we haven't created an RTO. We value capacity. We've got the states down there interested in building capacity as quickly as we can, and we value that by essentially socializing the cost of capacity, which is what I think we need to do more of across the country.
Go for it.
Grid operators need to first identify all, not just a few, of the reliability attributes. For an example, everyone knows that fuel security is a valuable attribute, and the market doesn't favorably do any justice when it comes to that. So for an example, one of the most fuel securities you can have is that fuel on site when needed. So to Jimmy's point, dispatchable fuel that's there. Take coal for an example. Coal can be stored, 2-3 months of supplies can be stored at the site when needed. Whereas natural gas and some of the others, you're totally dependent upon pipelines to deliver the source to you, or other things that could go in the way of that as well. So in my opinion, I think coal is villainized there. They're not really on the open free market. They do not get the fuel attributes that they should get credit for having that fuel on site, on demand, when needed. And as I said before, it can be fluctuate to demand, but it can be stored on site, and the market does not value that at all, in my opinion.
My next question is policy, and try to be quick about this one, but policy wish list. So 3 policies that could dramatically transform the grid for the better, and I'll have Brad go first.
So I'm going to just take the privilege of going a little bit beyond the grid.
Okay.
First and foremost, and this builds nicely on what we just discussed, we urgently need permitting reform. And so, sometimes, and I'll be brief about this, this is important, sometimes you make progress on policy when everybody's losing and one side isn't winning, And so whether you look at it from an industry perspective, like you need more capacity, you need to bring projects online, the failure to get permits hurts you. If you are a climate advocate and you're looking at the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act and all of these policies to support clean energy, and you can't build projects, then you're missing that opportunity for deployment. So this is starting a conversation. It won't happen in an election year most likely, but this is starting a first serious conversation in a generation about permitting reform. Second, critical minerals development. We are dangerously dependent as a country, reliant on China, but not just China, for critical minerals and rare earth elements. Yes, this is about our clean energy and industrial economy and especially the rare earths that we need for those technologies, but it's also about our national security. And so we have to have a robust effort that enabling new mining, both from a permitting standpoint, but advanced technologies to produce our own resources at home, but also refining capacity. And then also getting minerals from wastes and unconventional feedstocks like mine coal, coal waste, mine tailings, a whole range of things. And then finally, support for procurement. And what I mean by that is and we don't have time to go into the details, but if you look at the $62 billion in energy and climate investments from the infrastructure bill over 5 years, the federal financing that's available in that legislation, and then the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States now has the most robust policy framework in the world to incentivize private capital to flow into projects, okay? But what we don't have is government support to stimulate demand in new markets. And it's really hard in the industry that some of these gentlemen and others in the room represent, where you have capital that costs, in some cases, billions of dollars for a mine or a facility. And then you're going to take that risk and you don't know whether someone's going to pay that extra margin for that product. And in the near term, the government can play that role of covering that incremental cost, and there's a lot of ways to do that. It's actually not expensive, because when you take the cost of zero carbon electricity or a zero carbon product produced by industry in the context of cement or steel or a finished project, it's actually a tiny part of the overall cost. But in a commodity market, it's a big deal, and government can help close that gap, and that will help folks in the business, whether you need to deliver power with a lower carbon footprint or carbon-free cement. You can invest with the understanding that there's going to be some market demand going forward.
A national energy policy. We cannot continue to try to modify the grid in 4-year sprints that go in one direction, and then 4 years later we end up going in a different direction. We have to have something that is a consistent guidepost for the industry, for us to be able to make the kinds of investments to change the transmission infrastructure, bring in new generation of all types in order to be able to serve the growing needs of the country. Permit reform, I absolutely agree with. We can't operate when loads can land nearly a decade sooner than what we can deliver on those. And then the last thing I would say is, let's be honest about the pace that this world can actually change, that we can actually move the grid in a way that keeps it reliable, affordable, and resilient.
First, we need to be realistic and make sure the pace of the grid transition doesn't get out of control. Speed will kill us. This will allow time to build a better, more reliable grid based on technologies that are under development but may not be ready at this particular time. Second, EPA rules should not drive our energy policy or our electricity supply. As a nation, we can develop policies that improve the environment without causing reliability problems or making electricity unaffordable. And third, I wrote these down because I wanted to make sure I remember them. Third, we need to do 3 simple things. Before dispatchable electricity sources are allowed to retire, 1, replacement generating capacity should be built and in operation, still in the ground. 2, the replacement capacity should have at least the same capacity value and other reliability attributes as the retiring capacity. And third, any transmission that is needed to accommodate the replacement capacity should be built not merely planned or under construction. We've seen this play out already to whereas, we've had one development like these coal-fired plant retirements. If you look, you've seen a lot of them back up on those, backdate them, more years they're going to run. Jimmy just spoke about that. And the reason they're doing that is to make sure that they can supply their customers. Again, I think the transition is, and that's why we started our Not So Fast campaign. We truly believe that it's at an accelerated pace that cannot maintain the grid today or the electricity need to flourish or to have industrial growth.
All right. I'm curious, not all of you need to answer this one, but quickly, what is your take on geologic hydrogen and blending hydrogen into the fuel supply for natural gas-fired power plants? Any of you guys want to talk about that?
Y'all are funding something.
Well, on the hydrogen turbines for power plants, that's in process. There's already turbines that are commercially rated that are in the market, but we are funding continued research and development to improve the technology, both pure hydrogen as well as hydrogen blends. It's not the toughest R&D challenge. It's metallurgy. Obviously, you're talking about a lot higher heat and some other characteristics of hydrogen with metals. What was the other part? Was
geologic hydrogen and then blending hydrogen to fuel supply.
I personally know less about geologic hydrogen, but my colleagues who are working on it at the Department of Energy are pretty excited because we think an industry thinks the resource is bigger than we would have anticipated. So that could accelerate the build out of a hydrogen economy if you can actually take hydrogen from the earth and not also have to build out the systems to produce it as well.
I think there's an opportunity here for hydrogen to play a major role potentially in the generation of electricity as we go forward. But again, we're going to have to be open. We're going to have to let the market, in my view, make the decisions about how best to do that. If we have requirements that it's going to have to be green hydrogen, then I'm not sure that that's going to work. I don't think there's enough water that we're going to be able to manage that. And so, but if you will let the market determine how best to bring that hydrogen to the table, and so for instance, if we wanted blue hydrogen, what are we going to do with the carbon? I think we might be able to manage that carbon. In fact, we're a lot of investment in that space right now. So again, I think there's a possibility. I am a little concerned about it because the large scale nature of the amount of hydrogen that we would need, we would have to see those prices come down fairly dramatically as we move through this process. So I think it's a possibility, but like many of the things we've talked about today, I'm afraid it's a 15 to 20 year outlook before we actually see it make a dent in the energy infrastructure here.
Yeah, I think it's one of the exciting things that's out there, but again, it's the timing issue. It's not going to replace any of the grid that we have today because it's several years out. We've been approached about it actually, and some of it is fairly exciting because there's, theory out there that you could take a coal-fired plant that is shut down and you could make a hydrogen source there at the site, possibly even using coal or waste coal in that manner. So we're kind of excited to see the new development, but I haven't quite figured out yet how they're going to transport it and get it to the site. So I think there's a lot of unknowns about hydrogen, but again, using an all-above approach, I think we should value it and let free markets take it where it takes it.
Yeah, so I have a similar view of just, my approach to, as I said, is energy freedom. So with CO2, it's like liberating, getting all the obstacles out of the way so different things can pursue their potential. I try not to be too prejudiced about what exactly the potential is. What I'm very prejudiced about is committing to restrictions on the thing that works and promising that a hypothetical thing will work. We're seeing that fail already, and that's a way to commit suicide in the future. All right, I want to make sure to get in my final question, then we may get into some others. Also, again, Michelle, can you stand up? Sorry. Just get your I Love Fossil Fuels pins from her. She can also help you get energy talking points, and if you have the QR codes, scan them so that you can get the resources. All right, so this is the most topical for me. The prevailing political goal guiding energy policy today is net zero by 2050. And I know it can be hard to take a stance on this view, but I'm curious on your view of this goal. Is it a good goal, a dangerous goal, or somewhere in between? Brad.
I think it's a good goal. First of all, it's not a policy, and it's not just political, as the question characterized. It's a metric, and it's a metric to which we can hold ourselves accountable. I would say it's very challenging to get to net zero by 2050. I would also suggest to everyone in the room that I think challenging net zero in the sense of contending with the climate science behind it has not served industry well. I moved back to my own state of North Dakota in 1997, and I remember Basin Electric was funding the Greening Earth Society, and every week in my email inbox I get an article. I remember one was how more CO2 in the atmosphere increases tomatoes and other vegetable production. And I understand, as someone from North Dakota with the coal industry and an oil and gas industry and the job space and the pride with which the people have and they bring to that work, I understand the sense of threat that people feel to their livelihoods. But we are losing an entire generation. In fact, we've lost 2 generations of young people around the world by not embracing this challenge, being optimistic about the technologies. I don't disagree with any of the concerns that my colleagues on the panel have raised about reliability. But basically rejecting a net zero framework means that we're not willing to tackle the problem. I think you can be in favor of energy abundance, you can be optimistic about technology, and still get to net zero. In fact, one of my friends and colleagues, Vicki Hall, the CEO of Occidental Petroleum, would very much disagree with your characteristic of net zero. She thinks it's exactly where a large oil company should be, and she thinks hydrocarbons are part of net zero. And it's about decarbonizing the molecule. And there are lots of pathways to do that. Does that mean that oil and gas production in 2050 will be at the same level it is today? No, it may be less, but the value obtained from that oil and gas production could be substantially greater, and the job space could be as well. So I think we need to embrace this as a challenge, and as much as possible, well, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so I don't know if this camera, I'll try to make this come across in my talk. Like, the key is net zero is based on, by 2050, is based on horrifically bad thinking. That's fossil fuel benefit denial, climate mastery benefit denial, and the distortion of climate science. So it's not about denying any negative climate impact. It's about actually embracing science, but also embracing economic reality. And I do think that's a message that can win people over. And just saying, I agree with net zero because people who claim that climate science leads to it, that's totally illogical, and you're doing yourselves a disservice if you pretend that your industry doesn't have unique benefits that the world needs for the foreseeable future, and that policies to get rid of those benefits, and that would get rid of those benefits by destroying them before there's any reliable replacement in a world that needs far more energy, like, that is not a winning thing. So it's not about just burying your head in the sand, not engaging climate science, or capitulating to net zero. It's about a new pro-freedom, pro-human path forward.
I think as an aspiration, it's a laudable, I think it's an absolutely laudable goal to attempt to achieve, but to set it as an absolute goal scares me a little bit. I mean, the only thing I know is between now and 2050, I will no longer be the CEO at Santee Cooper. And so while there may be that tempt to just, hey, I can lock in my successors, no problem, I'm reluctant to do that. I've not suggested doing that. What I do know is between now and 2035, Santee Cooper is going to reduce our emissions by 55%. And after that, I'm uncertain. I believe that technology will advance. I really, truly do. I think we will see new technologies come to the table that may enable us to accelerate beyond that. But I can't see that path right now. So what I'm afraid of, by setting it as a hard goal for any organization, will you do anything to make it happen? Will you sacrifice affordability? Will you sacrifice reliability in order to make that happen? That's my only concern about setting it as a goal. I think it's a wonderful aspiration.
Jimmy?
I think for us, it's somewhere in the middle to dangerous. So let me talk about the dangerous part first. If you look, in 2012, we had 300,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation in the US. At the end of last year, we had 180,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation. Now, some of those were shut down for economic reasons and other things, but it doesn't matter. The fact is that's what we have remaining today. So when I look at, the fast pace that we're trying to do this is where I think it's very dangerous. For an example, we could very easily lose our competitive advantage. The critical minerals that's needed for this transition, China today has 80 to 90% of the market. If we continue to have an unreliable grid, increase our cost of electricity, it's only going to give them another advantage. The other side of it is, the White House announced that they expect the demand for critical minerals to increase by 500% for this energy transition. Where are we going to get them? I mean, it takes 10 to 15 years to get, depending upon the type, to get these mines permitted, in place, and up and operating. Again, I think the transition pace that they're on doesn't allow time for that. And then the last thing is, like Brad, I'm excited about the technology that can come forward, but where this becomes dangerous is, what do we lose in the meantime? Why are we not thinking about what we have, and even in the short term? Plans have been announced. If we lose 40 to 60% of our coal-fired generation here in the U.S., I do not see how the grid is going to function as it is today. And to me, it's a real danger of moving too fast and not really, to Alex's point very early, not really taking into account of the unintended consequences that Russia will get us to. I mean, think about Europe. Europe shut all their coal.
We got to wrap up. Can you have one or two more sentences?
Yeah. I was just going to really quick talk about Europe when they shut down their coal-fired generation. When Russia shut off the gas supply to them, they fired those back up and they were able to do them. Here in the U.S., we get extremely anxious to demolish those coal-fired plants. So we may not have the opportunity to come back to those. So let's use all the technology and innovations out there. Let's get it right. Let's have a transition in a timely manner that every American can enjoy the way of life we have today, and we're energy independent ourselves.
So I think all of you are too nice to net zero. Just say a couple final sentences and then we'll thank everyone. If energy is everything, why aren't we focused on making priority number one, expanding the availability of energy? Let's have global energy abundance by 2050. Let's have global human flourishing by 2050. That matters a hell of a lot more than how much CO2 is in the atmosphere, because with energy you can deal with just about any amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and without energy it doesn't matter how much CO2 is in the atmosphere because life sucks. So instead of allowing it to be framed as when exactly do we get rid of CO2 emissions, let's frame it as energy is the most important thing, let's bring it to everyone. That's my opinion. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to all of our panelists.